Episode 1. What is Genuinism? Genuinism is a practice of observation. It's a practice of observing how nature and how people's behaviors react with one another. The goal of genuinism is to try to come to terms with what are called universal truths. You can do this only by being unbiased. That means not taking sides. When you do this, you have an opinion that is unbiased and you observe nature to guide you to your so-called universal truth. I will give an example of one of the so-called deeds that was directed from genuinism. So one of the primary sayings for genuinism is how you can detect evil. So when you detect evil, it comes down to a simple process, and that process is if you are hurting someone or hurting something when you don't need to, and that's the question, if you need to do it. If you're hurting somebody or hurting something when you don't need to, you're doing evil. Now, that's a good example of a product of genuinism because it doesn't come from the Bible and it doesn't come from a religious text. It doesn't come from any religious text. It doesn't come from any philosophical text. The way that came about, the way that adage came about was through observation of nature and people's behavior. So from observing nature and how it reacts within people's behavior, we were able to come up with a universal truth. A universal truth meaning that it will either across the board affect people the same way or mostly affect people the same way. So back to the example again. How to detect evil. That's just one adage that was brought into being by genuinism. And there are many, many more. But this is a good example. Now let's go over it again one more time. Okay. So how do we detect evil? Well, if you're hurting someone or hurting something when you do not need to, you're doing evil. So how did this come about? Well, when we started to observe nature, how nature reacts with animal behavior and people behavior and how people respond, you could come to the conclusion that we all have a very similar response to certain actions. Okay, for example, if a person kills a rabbit because he's hungry and will starve to death if he doesn't eat, if he kills the rabbit for the purpose of sustaining himself, kills the rabbit, what happens is that he kills the rabbit as fast as he could and he uses that rabbit's body so that he doesn't die. In other words, he eats the rabbit. Now if a person catches a rabbit and starts torturing the rabbit and has no desire to eat it and is doing bad things just for the sadistic pleasure, then it's evil. Okay, so there's a different goal for each term of killing, for that matter. But it doesn't matter the circumstance. You can hurt something and not kill it and do so sadistically and gain pleasure from it, while some people hurt people accidentally or hurt people out of compulsion they can't control. The old thing always comes to the old adage, which means if you are hurting someone or hurting something when you do not need to, you're doing evil. Now, there's obviously different degrees of this, and most of us as human beings actually, fall into this at one point or another. But once you're aware of it, and that's the big question, are you aware of it? Well, if you are aware of it, what happens is we become more vigilant not to fall into doing evil behavior. Now, this is just one example of how genuinism, observing nature and observing people's behavior unbiasedly, came up with a very good adage. And there are many more adages that lead to what we call universal truths. That's why the observation practice of genuinism is so important.